Zainab sat on the worn wooden bench outside her family's modest home, staring at the dusty street that stretched into the bustling heart of Lagos. The air was thick with the familiar scent of roasted corn and fried akara from Mama Risi's roadside stall. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing through the neighborhood. Zainab clutched her notebook to her chest, her fingers gripping the edges tightly as if it were a shield against the world. Her limp had always been her silent adversary, a constant reminder of the accident that had changed her life forever. She was just 6 years old when it happened. Her father, Baba Zainab, had taken her to the market on a rare day off from his taxi driving. Zainab, with her playful energy, had run ahead of him, eager to see the colorful stalls. She never saw the car that sped through the crowded street until it was too late. The accident left her with a permanent limp and a deep scar on her right leg. Baba Zainab had sold almost everything they owned to pay for her medical bills. The neighborhood rallied around them, but sympathy soon gave way to pity, and Zainab grew to hate the way people looked at her, with a mixture of sadness and awkward discomfort. By the time she started secondary school, the limp had become a defining feature of her identity. It wasn't just the physical challenge that weighed her down, it was the relentless judgment and ridicule from her peers. At Unity High School, the students were as unforgiving as the scorching Lagos sun. They had a way of magnifying flaws, turning them into sources of entertainment. Stumbler, someone would shout whenever she walked into the classroom, and the laughter would ripple through the room. The nickname stuck, branding her as an outsider. Her classmates mocked the way she walked, mimicking her uneven steps in exaggerated performances that left her humiliated. Even the teachers, though kinder, often overlooked her, as if her limp rendered her invisible. Unity High was a prestigious school, known for its academic excellence and competitive spirit. The students prided themselves on their polished appearances, confident demeanors, and social cliques. For Zainab, every day felt like a battle. Her uniform, mended multiple times by her mother's careful hands, stood out against the crisp, new uniforms of her classmates. Her scuffed shoes, a hand-me-down from her cousin, were a constant source of embarrassment. Bola was the queen bee of Unity High, the embodiment of everything Zainab was not. Tall, elegant, and effortlessly beautiful, Bola ruled the school with a charisma that was both magnetic and intimidating. She was always surrounded by her clique, girls who mirrored her confidence and boys who vied for her attention. For Bola, Zainab was an easy target. "Stumbler, where's your escort today?" Bola sneered one afternoon as Zainab limped into the classroom. The other students erupted into laughter, and Zainab's face burned with humiliation. She clutched her books tighter and kept her head down, willing herself to disappear. But the worst moments weren't the taunts or the laughter, they were the silences. The times when Zainab would sit alone during lunch, her tray of rice and beans untouched, while the other students chatted and laughed in groups. She longed for companionship, for someone to see beyond her limp and her tattered uniform. Her only solace was her love for learning. Zainab excelled in her studies, her intelligence a sharp contrast to the dismissive judgments of her peers. She spent hours poring over her textbooks, immersing herself in the worlds of science, literature, and history. Her teachers often praised her in class, but their encouragement did little to shield her from the sting of her classmates' cruelty. At home, Zainab found comfort in her parents' unwavering love. Her father, though exhausted from long hours driving his taxi, always made time to ask about her day. Her mother, Mama Zainab, was a pillar of strength, running a small akara stall to supplement the family's income. They were proud of their daughter's academic achievements and often reminded her that her worth wasn't defined by the opinions of others. "Zainab, you are like the kola nut," her mother would say, using a traditional metaphor. "Bitter on the outside, but cherished for what's inside." Despite their support, Zainab couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. She avoided mirrors, unable to look at her reflection without feeling a wave of self-loathing. She compared herself to the girls at school, their flawless skin, their stylish braids, their confident strides, and felt like she could never measure up. One evening, after a particularly rough day at school, Zainab sat on her bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of their small room. Her mother's sewing machine hummed in the background as she repaired yet another of Zainab's uniforms. The rhythmic sound was usually comforting, but tonight, it grated against her already frayed nerves. "Why me, God?" Zainab whispered into the darkness. "Why did you make me like this?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Zainab wiped away a tear and turned to her books, seeking refuge in the familiar comfort of knowledge. But even as she immersed herself in equations and literary passages, the weight of her pain remained. The following week, Unity High was abuzz with excitement. The school's annual pageant was approaching, a glamorous event that showcased the most confident and beautiful students. Bola, of course, was the favorite to win. Her posters were already plastered around the school, each one featuring her radiant smile and perfectly styled hair. Zainab avoided the hallways where the posters hung, but she couldn't escape the chatter. During lunch, the other students discussed their favorite contestants, their voices filled with admiration and envy. Zainab sat at her usual corner table, her head down, pretending not to listen. "Why don't you enter, stumbler?" one of the boys jeered as he walked past her. His friends laughed, and Zainab clenched her fists under the table. She bit her lip, holding back the retort that bubbled in her chest. What was the point? Words wouldn't change anything. That evening, as she walked home, Zainab took her usual route through the market. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the bustling stalls. It was here that she first noticed Mama Abani, the old woman who sat weaving baskets by the roadside. Zainab had seen her before, her frail figure a constant presence in the chaos of the market. "Ah, my child," Mama Abani called out as Zainab passed by. Her voice was soft but commanding, laced with an air of mystery. "Why do you walk with such a heavy heart?" Zainab hesitated, unsure whether to respond. But something in the old woman's eyes, a glimmer of understanding, a hint of compassion, drew her closer. She sat down beside her, clutching her bag tightly. "I'm just tired," Zainab said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mama Abani smiled, her hands never pausing in their work. "Tired of carrying the weight of the world, Don't worry, my child. The world has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Zainab didn't know what to make of the old woman's words, but as she walked away, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The next day, Zainab walked to school with Mama Abani's words still lingering in her mind. The morning air was cool, but the familiar weight of dread settled on her shoulders as she approached the school gates. She knew what awaited her: snickers, whispers, and taunts. But somewhere deep inside, a faint curiosity about Mama Abani's promise flickered, keeping her moving forward. As expected, the moment she limped into the schoolyard, the mocking began. Bola's clique was already gathered near the basketball court, their polished uniforms and braided hairstyles perfect as always. Bola herself was perched on one of the benches, surrounded by admirers, her laughter ringing out like a bell. "Look who's here," Bola said loudly, her voice dripping with mockery. "The star of yesterday's assembly. Tell me, stumbler, are you planning another performance today?" The group erupted into laughter, and Zainab felt the familiar sting of shame. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to keep walking. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But by the time she reached her classroom, the lump in her throat had grown unbearable. The day passed in a blur of humiliation and isolation. By lunchtime, Zainab had had enough. She decided to skip the noisy cafeteria and retreat to her usual hiding spot under the large mango tree behind the school. There, she could eat in peace and escape the constant judgment of her peers. As she sat on the cool grass, nibbling on a piece of bread her mother had packed for her, she thought about her conversation with Mama Abani. The old woman's words had been strange, almost otherworldly. Come back tomorrow, and I will help you. What could she possibly mean? Zainab shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was probably just the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. Still, something about Mama Abeni's gaze had stayed with her. It was as though the woman could see straight into her soul, past the limp and the scars, past the layers of self-doubt and pain, to the person Zainab longed to be. That thought gave her a flicker of hope, and she decided she would visit Mama Abeni again after school. As the final bell rang, Zainab packed her books and left the classroom, ignoring the jeers of her classmates as she limped past them. She walked quickly, eager to reach the market before it grew too crowded. The familiar hustle and bustle greeted her as she entered the market, the air filled with the aroma of roasted plantains and the shouts of vendors advertising their goods. She found Mama Abeni in her usual spot, sitting cross-legged on a worn mat with a basket of woven goods beside her. The old woman looked up as Zainab approached, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Ah, my child. You've come," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. "Sit with me." Zainab hesitated for a moment before lowering herself onto the mat. She fidgeted with the hem of her skirt, unsure of how to begin. I don't know why I came," she admitted finally. "You said you could help me, but I don't understand how." Mama Abeni nodded, her eyes twinkling with a knowing light. "You are searching for something, Zainab," she said. "You want to be seen, to be valued. But you believe that your worth lies in how others perceive you." Zainab looked down, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. The old woman had hit the nail on the head, but hearing it said aloud made her feel vulnerable. "Tell me, child," Mama Abeni continued, leaning closer. "If you could have one wish, anything at all, what would it be?" Zainab blinked, startled by the question. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her mind raced as she thought about all the things she wanted: to be free of her limp, to be beautiful, to be loved. But could she really ask for such things? Wasn't it foolish to even dream of them? I don't know," she stammered finally. Mama Abeni chuckled, her laughter warm and soothing. "Take your time," she said. "Close your eyes, and listen to your heart. It will tell you what you truly desire." Zainab hesitated, but something about the old woman's tone compelled her to obey. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the sounds of the market fade into the background. In the stillness, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life where she walked confidently, where people admired her instead of mocking her, where she felt beautiful and loved. "I want to be perfect," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want to walk without a limp, to be beautiful, and to be loved." When she opened her eyes, Mama Abeni was smiling at her, a knowing glint in her eyes. "It is done," she said simply. Zainab frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "For 14 days, you will have the life you desire," Mama Abeni explained. "You will walk with grace, radiate beauty, and command the admiration of all who see you. But remember, every gift comes with a lesson. Use this time wisely, my child." Zainab stared at her, unsure whether to believe her words. Was this some kind of joke? But before she could ask any more questions, Mama Abeni reached into her basket and pulled out a small woven bracelet. "Wear this," she said, handing it to Zainab. "It will remind you of the kindness that brought you here. And when the time comes, you will understand its purpose." Zainab accepted the bracelet hesitantly, slipping it onto her wrist. It felt warm against her skin, almost as if it were alive. She looked up at Mama Abeni, her mind racing with questions, but the old woman simply smiled and gestured for her to go. "Your time begins now, my child. Go and see the world anew." That night, Zainab lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Mama Abeni's words replayed in her mind. She still didn't know whether to believe them, but a small part of her couldn't help but hope. What if it were true? What if she really could have the life she'd always dreamed of? Her thoughts were interrupted by a strange sensation, a tingling warmth that spread through her body. She sat up, her heart pounding as she looked down at her hands. They seemed different. Smoother, softer, as though the scars and calluses she'd always known had vanished. She scrambled out of bed and rushed to the small mirror in the corner of the room. What she saw made her gasp. The girl staring back at her was unrecognizable. Her skin glowed with a radiant warmth, her features were perfectly symmetrical, and her eyes sparkled with an otherworldly light. She reached up to touch her face, half expecting the reflection to disappear, but it didn't. This was her. Somehow, impossibly, this was her. Her legs felt strong and steady as she took a cautious step forward, then another. There was no limp, no pain, just smooth, graceful movement. Zainab's breath caught in her throat as a wave of emotions washed over her. For the first time in her life, she felt beautiful. She didn't know how it had happened, but she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again. As she lay back down, a single thought repeated in her mind. This is my chance. I won't waste it. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, bathing Zainab's room in a warm golden glow. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the brightness. For a moment, she thought the events of the previous night had been a dream. But as she stretched her legs and felt the absence of the familiar ache in her joints, a surge of excitement rushed through her. She jumped out of bed, the movement fluid and effortless. The limp that had once defined her was gone. Her heart raced as she walked to the mirror, and there it was again, the reflection that left her breathless. Her glowing skin, her smooth features, and the steady strength in her legs. She looked perfect. Zainab couldn't contain the smile that spread across her face. She twirled in front of the mirror, marveling at how light and graceful she felt. The woven bracelet from Mama Abani glinted in the sunlight, a reminder of the old woman's words. 14 days, Zainab whispered to herself. This is my time. Her mother's voice called from the kitchen, pulling her back to reality. Zainab, you'll be late for school if you don't hurry. Zainab's heart skipped a beat. School. For the first time in years, she didn't feel dread at the thought of walking through the gates of Unity High. Instead, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and curiosity. How would they react? The students who had tormented her, the teachers who had overlooked her, what would they say when they saw her? When Zainab arrived at the school gate, the reaction was immediate. Heads turned as she walked in, her posture confident and her movements graceful. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave, and she could hear fragments of their astonished conversations. Who's that? She's gorgeous. Is she a new student? I've never seen her before. Zainab's heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm. She walked past the crowd, her chin held high, relishing the attention. It was a strange, heady feeling to be noticed for something other than her limp or her scars. As she approached her classroom, she spotted Bola and her clique gathered by the lockers. They were laughing and chatting, their voices carrying down the hallway. Zainab hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders and walked straight past them. Bola looked up, her laughter fading as her eyes landed on Zainab. For a brief moment, her confident facade faltered. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but no words came out. Zainab didn't stop or acknowledge her. She kept walking, her heart pounding with triumph. Inside the classroom, the reaction was the same. Students who had never given her a second glance now stared openly, their curiosity and admiration evident. Even Tund, the most popular boy in school and Bola's on-again, off-again boyfriend, couldn't take his eyes off her. He approached her desk, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by a hesitant smile. "Hi," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I don't think we've met before. Are you new?" Zainab looked up at him, her expression cool and composed. "No," she said simply. I've been here all along. Tund frowned, clearly confused, but before he could say more, the teacher walked in, signaling the start of the lesson. Zainab hid a smile as she opened her notebook. For the first time, she felt like she had the upper hand. Over the next few days, Zainab's transformation continued to captivate the school. She excelled in class, her sharp intellect impressing even the toughest teachers. She began participating in group activities, something she had avoided in the past, and her confidence shone through in every interaction. Students flocked to her, eager to befriend her and learn her secrets. Bola, however, was not pleased. She watched from the sidelines as Zainab stole the spotlight, her jealousy growing with each passing day. She couldn't understand how this mysterious girl had appeared out of nowhere, commanding attention and admiration so effortlessly. Bola's frustration boiled over one afternoon during lunch. Zainab was sitting at a table with a group of students, laughing and chatting easily. Tund was by her side, hanging on to her every word. Bola stormed over, her clique trailing behind her. "Excuse me," Bola said sharply, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Who do you think you are?" The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Zainab. She looked up at Bola, her expression calm and unbothered. "I'm Zainab," she said simply. "Is there a problem?" Bola's eyes narrowed. "Zainab? That's impossible. You're lying." Zainab tilted her head, her smile faint but unmistakable. "I'm not lying. Maybe you just never noticed me before." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Bola looked genuinely taken aback. But she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a sneer. "Well, whatever game you're playing, it won't last. People like you don't belong at the top." Zainab met her gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "We'll see about that," she said softly. As the days went by, Zainab's popularity continued to soar. Teachers praised her intelligence, students sought her company, and even Bola's closest friends began to drift away from her. For the first time, Zainab felt powerful. She was no longer the girl who hid in the shadows, the girl who was ridiculed and ignored. She was finally the person she had always dreamed of being. But beneath the surface, doubts began to creep in. The attention she received felt hollow, the friendship superficial. Tund's admiration, once flattering, now felt insincere. He didn't know the real her, the girl who had struggled and suffered, who had fought to survive in a world that seemed determined to break her. Late one night, as she lay in bed, Zainab found herself thinking about Mama Abani. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, "Every gift comes with a lesson." Zainab wondered what lesson she was supposed to learn. Was this life of beauty and admiration really what she wanted? Or was there something more she had yet to discover? The highlight of the week was the announcement of the contestants for the upcoming school pageant. To no one's surprise, Zainab's name was at the top of the list. Bola's name was also there, but for the first time, she wasn't the favorite. The students whispered excitedly about the competition, speculating about who would win. Zainab felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as she prepared for the event. She knew this was her chance to solidify her place at the top, to prove to everyone that she was more than just a pretty face. But she also felt the weight of her secret, the knowledge that this life wasn't truly hers. As the day of the pageant approached, Zainab couldn't shake the feeling that her time was running out. The bracelet on her wrist seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, a constant reminder of the deal she had made with Mama Abani. She had 14 days to live her dream, but what would happen when the time was up? Would she go back to being invisible, to being Stumbler? Or had she changed enough to carry this newfound confidence into her real life? Zainab didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain, the journey was far from over. The day of the school pageant arrived with a mix of excitement and tension. The entire school buzzed with anticipation, and the grand assembly hall was transformed into a vibrant stage adorned with colorful decorations. Unity High School's most prestigious event was about to begin, and the students were eager to see who would emerge victorious. Zainab stood backstage, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. She wore a fitted, golden dress that shimmered under the bright lights. Her hair, now long and silky, was styled into cascading waves that framed her glowing face. She hardly recognized herself. She had become the kind of girl she used to envy, a picture of beauty and confidence. Yet, as she looked into her own eyes, she felt a pang of unease. The bracelet from Mama Ebony was still on her wrist, hidden beneath the sleeves of her dress. Its weight seemed heavier now, as if it carried the burden of the secrets she was keeping. The 14 days were almost up, and though Zainab had gained everything she thought she wanted, she couldn't ignore the growing emptiness inside her. Out in the audience, the students chattered excitedly. Bola was seated with her clique near the front row, her smile tight as she scanned the stage. For the first time, she wasn't the center of attention. The spotlight was on Zainab, the mysterious girl who had stolen her throne. Bola's resentment had been simmering all week. She couldn't understand how Zainab had suddenly transformed from the overlooked stumbler to the school's shining star. It wasn't just the beauty, Zainab's confidence and intelligence had captivated everyone, including Tund. The thought of losing her status as the queen bee to someone she considered beneath her was unbearable. "Let's see if she can handle the pressure," Bola muttered under her breath, crossing her arms. She had a plan, and she was determined to ensure that Zainab's reign would be short-lived. The pageant kicked off with the contestants introducing themselves. Zainab's voice was clear and confident as she spoke, earning applause and cheers from the audience. Bola followed, her tone dripping with practiced charm, but the enthusiasm for her was noticeably less. The competition progressed through various rounds, a talent showcase, a fashion segment, and a quiz on current events. Zainab excelled in every category, her intelligence and grace leaving the judges and audience in awe. Bola, though still poised and competitive, struggled to keep up. It was clear to everyone that the tide was turning in Zainab's favor. By the time the final round arrived, Zainab was leading the scoreboard. All that remained was the question and answer segment, a test of poise, wit, and authenticity. As the moderator called Zainab's name, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. The spotlight followed her as she stood before the microphone, the hall falling silent in anticipation. The moderator smiled at her, holding a card with the final question. "Zainab," he said, "can you tell us what beauty means to you?" Zainab froze. The question echoed in her mind, and for a moment, she was overwhelmed by a wave of uncertainty. She had spent the past 2 weeks basking in the admiration of others, but she had never stopped to think about the true essence of beauty. What did it mean to her? Was it the flawless face she now wore, the graceful steps she took, or the applause that followed her everywhere she went? Her gaze shifted to the audience, scanning the familiar faces. She saw Tund, his expression one of admiration. She saw Bola, her eyes narrowed with jealousy. And then, at the back of the hall, she spotted someone she hadn't expected to see, Mama Ebony. The old woman sat quietly, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Zainab. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a gentle encouragement that sent a wave of clarity through Zainab's mind. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the microphone. "Beauty," she began, her voice steady, "is not about how we look on the outside. It's about how we treat others and how we see ourselves. True beauty is kindness, resilience, and the courage to be authentic." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the audience erupted into applause, the sound filling the hall. Zainab felt a mix of relief and pride as she stepped back, her heart lighter than it had been in days. After the event, Zainab lingered backstage, avoiding the crowd. She needed a moment to herself, to process everything that had happened. The applause and admiration had felt good, but they hadn't filled the emptiness inside her. something was still missing. Her thoughts were interrupted by Bola, who stormed into the room, her face flushed with anger. "What game are you playing?" Bola demanded, her voice trembling with frustration. "How did you go from being a nobody to this?" Zainab turned to face her, her expression calm. "I'm not playing any game, Bola. I just stopped letting people define my worth." Bola scoffed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything, to have the world turn against you. You've taken everything from me." Zainab's heart softened as she looked at Bola. For all her cruelty, Bola was still human, and her words revealed a vulnerability Zainab hadn't expected. "I haven't taken anything from you," Zainab said gently. "You're still the same person you've always been. The only thing that's changed is how others see you, and that doesn't define who you are." Bola stared at her, speechless, before turning and walking away. Zainab watched her go, a pang of sympathy stirring in her chest. The next morning, Zainab woke with a strange sense of peace. Her reflection in the mirror still dazzled her, but it no longer carried the same thrill. Instead, it felt like a reminder, a fleeting mask that wasn't truly her. She traced the woven bracelet on her wrist, its texture grounding her, reminding her of the lessons Mama Abani had shared. The school hallways were abuzz with talk of the pageant. Zainab's speech had made waves, with students and teachers alike praising her insight. Even those who had once mocked her now looked at her with admiration. Yet, the more they celebrated her, the more Zainab felt disconnected. This wasn't her life, not really. She had 14 days to live as someone else, but those days were nearly over. As she walked into the schoolyard, she saw Bola sitting alone under a tree. Her usual entourage was nowhere to be found, and her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world pressed down on her. Zainab hesitated, then made her way over. "Bola," she said softly. Bola looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. For a moment, she seemed ready to lash out, but when she saw Zainab's calm expression, her anger dissolved. "What do you want?" Bola asked, her voice subdued. Zainab sat down beside her, the two of them silent for a moment. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Zainab said finally. "For everything." Bola frowned. "What do you mean? You didn't do anything." "I did," Zainab replied. "I wanted to hurt you because of how you hurt me. I thought that if I could take your place, I'd feel better. But it didn't work. I'm still trying to figure out who I really am." Bola stared at her, the anger in her expression replaced by confusion. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what it's like to feel small," Zainab said. "To feel like the world is against you. And I don't want to be the reason someone else feels that way." Bola's lips trembled, and she looked away. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything," she said quietly. "I've been on top for so long, and now I don't even know who I am anymore." Zainab reached out and placed a hand on Bola's arm. "Maybe it's time to find out," she said gently. "Being on top doesn't define you. What matters is who you are when no one's looking." That evening, Zainab went to the market one last time. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the bustling stalls. She found Mama Abani in her usual spot, her hands busy weaving another basket. "Ah, my child," Mama Abani said, her eyes twinkling as she looked up. "You've come to say goodbye." Zainab nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm not ready," she admitted. "I don't want to go back to being the girl everyone ignored." Mama Abani smiled kindly. "And why do you think they ignored you, Zainab?" "Because I wasn't beautiful," Zainab said. "I wasn't confident. I didn't belong." The old woman shook her head. "No, my dear. They ignored you because you didn't see your own worth. Beauty begins within, and confidence comes from knowing who you are. Do you know who you are now?" Zainab hesitated, then nodded. I think I do. I'm kind. I'm strong. And I'm enough, just as I am. Mama Abani's smile widened. Then you've learned the lesson. She reached for Zainab's bracelet and gently removed it. The moment it left her wrist, Zainab felt a strange sensation wash over her, like a cool breeze passing through her body. She looked down at her hands, which now bore the familiar scars and calluses of her old self. Her legs felt different, her limp returning with each step she took. Zainab walked to a small mirror on the edge of the stall. Her reflection was her own again. The face she had been born with, the one she had always tried to hide, now stared back at her. But instead of feeling shame, she felt a surprising sense of pride. This was who she was, and for the first time, she didn't want to change that. Thank you, Mama, Zainab said, turning back to the old woman. You've given me more than I ever could have asked for. Mama Abani patted her hand. No, child. You've given yourself the greatest gift of all. Now go and show the world who you truly are. When Zainab returned to school the next day, the students were surprised to see her. She no longer walked with the grace or wore the beauty that had captivated them during the pageant. But there was something different about her, something unshakable and real. She held her head high, her limp a part of her but no longer defining her. As she entered the classroom, the whispers began. Is that Zainab? Someone murmured. What happened to her? Zainab ignored the comments and took her seat, her confidence unwavering. She no longer needed their approval to feel whole. During lunch, she spotted Bola sitting alone again. This time, Zainab walked over and sat down beside her. Bola looked up, surprised. What are you doing here? Bola asked. Sharing my lunch, Zainab replied with a small smile. She slid half of her sandwich across the table. Everyone needs a friend. Bola stared at her for a moment, then smiled back, the tension between them finally dissolving. Zainab's transformation wasn't just about her appearance. Over the weeks that followed, she continued to grow, building genuine connections with her classmates and inspiring them with her kindness and resilience. She joined the debate club, where her sharp mind earned her the respect of her peers. She even started tutoring some of the younger students, using her experiences to encourage them to see their own worth. One afternoon, as she sat under the mango tree, Tund approached her, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous energy. Zainab, he said, scratching the back of his neck. I wanted to say sorry. For the way I treated you before. Zainab looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Tund, she said simply. But I don't need your apology. I've moved on. Tund nodded, his face a mix of relief and disappointment. He walked away, and Zainab felt a sense of closure. She didn't need his validation, or anyone else's. Zainab's life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had learned to embrace her flaws and find strength in her vulnerabilities. The words she had spoken at the pageant, about kindness, resilience, and authenticity, were now the foundation of her life. As she walked home that evening, the sun setting behind her, she felt a deep sense of peace. She was Zainab, and she was enough. This story reminds us that every person is created with purpose and worth, and sometimes the only thing standing between us and self-acceptance is